Welcome to Coaching with Ricky. I'm Ricky. Let's talk about 10 biggest mistakes that you should avoid in your career. Number one is talking only about what you do versus how you do it and why. People don't care about what you do. Titles and the context of what your scope and responsibilities are is very surface level. So, what leaders look for when they actually want to know if they want to promote you or if they want to invest in your growth is less about what you're actually doing and more about how you're doing it. How do you problem solve? How do you think and approach a situation that may have changed? How do you adapt to other people's styles? How do you influence people? And also the why. Why did you choose to take action in this way versus another? Those are much more meaningful for leaders and people to understand your thought process, and it allows them to see whether or not you have potential to continue growing in your career, or if you're just a doer, which is very much focused on getting the work done and that's it. Don't box yourself into that category of being a doer. I've seen many people who are very successful at doing the work, but not so great at articulating and highlighting their abilities when it comes to the how and the why. Those two factors are much more important than just talking about the what. Number two is not applying for that job until you meet 100% or close to 100% of the requirements. There's a study that was shown where men are much more confident and comfortable with applying for jobs when they don't even meet 75% of the requirements, let alone 100%. But when it comes to women, they're much more reserved and they're much more self-conscious about applying for roles until they meet majority of the requirements. That's actually working against you if you're not applying for jobs or not even considering jobs when you don't meet 100% of the requirements. It's similar to the thought where when you feel like you're ready for a change in a job or in life in general, that usually indicates it's a little past the point where you should have made some change. Because when you feel fully comfortable and ready for something, that usually means you're not going to be as challenged as you would have been if you had taken action sooner. Number three is not negotiating your pay or your salary when it comes to a new job offer or when there's a change in your scope. This happens often when a manager says, we have a reorg happening, or we're increasing your scope, or here's more work. People don't think there's an opportunity to negotiate. A pay discussion or an increase in salary can always take place regardless of whether you're interviewing externally for a new job or if there's some kind of change happening. The catalyst to have that conversation be easy is when there's change that happens. So of course, when you're interviewing for a new job, that's change, and that is the perfect opportunity once you get a job offer to start negotiating and saying, this is what I expect and this is where we're at. How can we get closer to the number that I'm looking for? On the other hand, when you're an existing employee on a team and there's some change happening, that is also a perfect opportunity for you to have a discussion about pay and salary increase. Because whenever change happens, you're taking on more work or something is happening to cause you to have to move things around on the team. A lot of times people miss out on that opportunity because they usually equate pay negotiations and salary negotiations just with interviewing for new jobs outside. Number four is gossiping about other colleagues. I've seen this happen so often, and I have to admit, earlier on in my career, I was also guilty of doing this. But just keep in mind, no matter how much you trust someone, and if they're your work BFF or something like that, when you start gossiping about other people in front of someone, their thought is going to be, if they're telling me this about that other person, I wonder what they're saying about me when I'm not in the room. That's just a natural human thought. When you hear someone bad-mouthing someone else, you start putting yourself in that situation and thinking, I wonder what they're saying about me behind my back. Number five is waiting to have development conversations around your career when you're already fed up with your manager or when you're already very frustrated. I see so many people get to that point, and what that does is it makes the conversation much less impactful and much less effective, because then you're having a conversation out of frustration as opposed to a strategic, objective conversation planning ahead to say, this is what I envision for my career. This is what I would like to grow into. I see people waiting too long and then getting to that point where they want something to happen tomorrow. And that's just not how businesses work. That's not how things are run. And unfortunately, when you're operating off of frustration and lack of patience, that doesn't make a manager and a leader want to help you. It doesn't make them want to invest in you. So the best times to have these conversations are actually when you first start off a new job, or at any point before you get to that frustration threshold where you're like, oh, they should have taken action. They should have done this already. When you start hearing yourself use words like, I should have had this happen already, or they should have already done this, that usually means you're nearing that frustration point and you want to avoid that. So have the conversation much earlier than you actually think. And also keep in mind that it's not a one and done kind of conversation. When it comes to career development, it's an ongoing conversation that you should be having with yourself in terms of what's important to you. What are the values that you look for on a team, in a manager, in a company? And you should be sharing this with your managers openly and having that ongoing conversation as opposed to expecting it to just be a one-time thing. Number 6 is closing off all other options and just seeing your career in one place. I think this is a mentality that a lot of older generations tend to have because that's what the norm was. People tended to stay at companies for 10 years, 15 years, 20 plus years. Nowadays, if you stay at a company for 5 years, that's considered a pretty long time. And so when the environments change and when the norm changes, you also have to keep up with that change. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a situation where you're just focusing on one company or one team and you have a very narrow-minded view of it. And if something happens or if something changes where you may lose that job or lose that role, then you may find yourself in a very vulnerable situation that you want to avoid. You can still be committed to one company, of course, while you're doing that job and doing it greatly. But you should also keep an open mind and be aware that there are other options out there. Be aware of what a fair market pay is for your role, for the number of years of experience that you offer, so that you're not caught in a situation where something changes beyond your control, that you don't have any context or you don't have any insight on what other options exist. That can feel very stressful, especially when we feel a little bit helpless. I've seen this happen where people get laid off, for example, and they're left with very little options because they didn't think ahead. And so when something triggers that for them, where they lose their job, they go into fight or flight mode and they don't know where to start. They become very frustrated and flustered. And usually that doesn't help them get back up on their feet and find a new job quickly. Number 7 is having a very concrete career plan that's very rigid with specific roles called out. While it's good to have a general idea of the progression that you want and maybe how many years it would take you to get there, it's not good to be very rigid in the sense of I want this title and I want that and have it be a linear path, because life doesn't happen linearly. In fact, career progression and career growth a lot of times happens more in a squiggly path upwards as opposed to one straight path up. So if you're expecting for yourself to set goals to say, I want this title, this title, this title, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed because that usually is not how people progress in their career. You can still do that and have an idea of what path you might want in the long term, but just know and expect that along the way, things can change and you might take lateral moves. And in fact, that makes you more well-rounded when you do lateral moves, as opposed to just progressively moving upward in one singular path. Number 8 is related to number 1, where people focus just on doing their work. And this is no longer enough. It might have been enough back in the day, or it might have been enough for a role that is more general, but nowadays it's not enough to just be doing your work. Because if you want career progression and if you want career growth, it takes more than that. It takes you putting yourself out there a little bit, expressing what your interests are, raising your hands for projects. Because when leaders look for people to invest in, they're not just looking for people that can do the job. They're not just looking for people focused on doing the work. That's almost an expectation of you doing your job. What I've seen is the people who do their job and do it great and also have focus on having conversations openly about what their intentions are and what their interests are. Number 9 is behaving or seeing things very differently depending on who's in the room or what level of people you're speaking with. People immediately pick up on that. If you behave in a very different way or you say things very differently depending on what their title is, people will notice, and that can work against you because that makes you come across as not as authentic and not as genuine, especially if you're changing your behaviors and maybe being more rude to people that are in lower titles or lower levels than you, as opposed to people who are higher levels. People notice that, and I have seen leaders actively call that out during performance discussions where they say, I've noticed that so-and-so behaves very differently depending on who they're talking to, and that's not a good look that you want to carry for yourself. Number 10 is a very, very common one, which is expecting your work to speak for itself. Your work will not speak for itself. You have to give it life. If you have very strong mentors and people who will advocate for you, that's great. When you're not in the room, you have people speaking on behalf of you. But chances are you don't have that. A lot of people don't have that because a lot of people don't think about having advocates and having an expansion of their network so that people can speak on behalf of them when they're not in the room. What I've seen more often is people who tend to be high achievers and they're very, very great at doing their jobs, but they're not focusing enough time and effort on talking about their accomplishments or sharing their accomplishments and highlighting their abilities to leaders if they want to move up in their career. So expecting your work to speak for itself is something that a lot of people have said in the past. I've even received that as advice from people, but after many years in the corporate world and growing to be an executive myself, I've seen time and time again that your work will not speak for itself. And I know there are cultural differences depending on which part of the world you may be in, but at the end of the day and at the core of it, I still firmly believe and have seen this to be true, where regardless of what culture or what environment you're in, whether it's in a more collective mindset or a more self-focused mindset, you have to be able to articulate your value and your worth and to know that for yourself. Because when you don't do that, people can pick up on that and people will notice that. So if you're not offering out your confidence and if you're not offering out your abilities and sharing that with people in the workplace, people will not see that value as strongly as they would when you do highlight that for them. Think of it not as showing off or boasting about yourself, and think of it more as helping leadership and managers see and understand how you work and see and understand your value and the impact that you bring. It's complementary to doing a great job. So you can do a great job and you can do great work and at the same time highlight it for people so they can connect those two and understand, oh, you're not just a great person who can execute and do X, Y, and Z when you're told. You're actually very strategic and thoughtful and objective about how to get a job done and how to work with other people. Those are all qualities that people look for when they want to invest in people and when they want to promote you. So think of it less as you bragging and more of you just sharing and highlighting your abilities to help people connect the dots and understand that you're more than just the work. You're more than just doing A, B, and C because you have more thought and more insights into how you can grow to be an effective leader.